Hello. Welcome to this first initiative dialogue of the new academic year. Most of you think the new year began in January, but at Georgetown it begins in September. We had hoped, frankly, that in this new year we'd be gathering in person, and some of us would be together and some would be online, but the Delta variant has not made that possible. We have hopes of doing that. We have found that these online dialogues have given us at the initiative a great chance to reach further and more people. I think this is our 35th dialogue since Georgetown's campus was closed down. We've reached 135,000 people. We have more than 1,500 people signed up for this dialogue. And I'm especially excited about that because this is a matter of great substance and great moment. While the country is focused on COVID, Delta, Afghanistan, the Woodward, Costa book, all the politics of that, the Congress is literally, as we speak, debating and deciding on the investments and taxes that will touch every family in America, will touch every community, and frankly, potentially for generations to come. And much of that conversation is about politics. Will the president have his way? Will the Republicans be able to stop him? What does this mean for the 2022 or 2024 election? We are asking a different set of questions. What does this mean in moral terms, in human terms? What does this mean for people at the bottom and the middle and the top? Who pays? Who gets left behind? And so we're very happy to have you with us. I would remind you that you can join the conversation at our hashtag, which is GU Budget Reconciliation. You can add a question by going to the email at the bottom, and we'll try and get your question to the panelists. We're especially pleased that for this first dialogue, we have a new partner, the Center on Faith and Justice, led by our good friend, Jim Wallace, and colleague. It's great to have Jim at Georgetown, and it's great to have them. Jim has made a great contribution to these questions of the moral and human dimensions of budget policy. So it's only right that we would do this together. This is going to be recorded and posted, so if you missed some of it or want to share it. But let me first go to sort of where we are. At this moment, as I said, these decisions are being made. We're going to take a look at who's making those decisions and how they're making them and what their impacts might be. And then we're going to talk about who gets affected. Our questions are not the political ones, they're the human ones. Who's going to be left behind? Whose families might be lifted up? How do the principles of Catholic social teaching, human dignity, human life, the Hyde Amendment might be at stake in this discussion. Principles of solidarity and subsidiarity, questions of basic human rights, of housing and healthcare are at issue here. And so we have a great group of people to do this. First is Ilana Shore, who is the Congress editor at Politico, previously covered faith and politics for the Associated Press. She's going to lead us off. Mary Novak is the new executive director of Network, the Catholic Social Justice Lobby. She's an old friend. Ashley Kenneth is the president and CEO of an organization many of you may not know yet, the Commonwealth Institute in Virginia, which tries to advance racial and academic justice in budget and other debates there and nationally. Ramesh Ponnuru will be the editor of the major national conservative magazine and website, media platform, I guess we call it, Ramesh, National Review. And we're happy to have him. And Carlos Malve ran Christian Churches Together, was the director, is starting a new Latino Christian national network, and is the co-chair of the Circle of Protection. And I'll say a little bit more about each of them when we talk later. But I first want to turn to Alana. You have been covering the Hill. You've been covering faith groups for a long time. Your team at Politico is doing a great job. It's hard to frankly find out what's going on in this process, but I would recommend people look at Politico. I came to know you when at the Associated Press, where you did a great job during the 2020 campaign on the faith dimensions. You've worked for The Guardian, Talking Points Memo, The Hill. I'm asking you, as an editor, as someone who connects the budget, the Congress, and faith and politics, set the stage, share the context for this discussion, our discussion of moral principles and human consequences and national priorities. What are the choices Congress faces? How will this be debated and decided? What's the scale and scope of this? What are the parts of the package? How's this likely to play out?
Thanks so much for those kind words, John, and thanks for having me. I think to set the stage, it's important to note that, first of all, the bill isn't done yet. We've been seeing markups in the House, and markups is sort of the committee level haggling over certain amendments that can be extremely consequential. But what really matters is going to happen next week, when leadership in the House and Senate is going to shape this. But to give a sense of just how big and impactful a bill we're potentially talking about, there's a briefing tomorrow with 12 committee chairs. That's almost every critical committee in the House touches a piece of this potential bill. Major planks, climate change action in the form of a clean electricity standard, extra childcare benefits, a lot of attention to taxes, including some proposed serious tax cuts on the wealthiest and on corporations. Now, this is just in the House. The Senate hasn't really taken its whack yet. So, we at Politico, specifically on my team, had a bit of a discussion about what we were even going to call the bill, right? Because reconciliation refers to the process by which it's going to be passed without Republican votes, but it doesn't really address the substance. And we went with social spending because it does affect a lot of social programs predominantly, and climate change is really a question of social good overall. But that, I think, is a good way for listeners to think about this debate, because social spending is almost too small of a concept. It requires talking about, what matters to us as human beings, as Americans. We use social to distinguish it from like a defense spending bill, right? Which is not really going to be tackled here. But this is massive. And again, just to underline, we don't yet know what's going to end up in the final bill. And that's because Democrats have majorities that are so small. It's 3 votes in the House, and literally they can't afford to lose a single senator in a 50-50 Senate. So if a single provision doesn't have sufficient buy-in from the party, it's not going to show up on the floor. So it's a really important conversation that's also challenging because the substance is a moving target right now. So that's kind of an opening thought as far as how to discuss it.
I loved your comment on what to call it. For religious leaders, reconciliation has a different meaning. For Catholics, it's a sacrament. For all people of faith, it's a mandate. It has nothing to do with what's going on in the Congress. It's not about reconciliation as we understand it. This is a bitter partisan fight about the priorities of the nation, the role of government, what kind of health for families, who will pay taxes. You're uniquely positioned in that you not only have covered Congress a lot, you've also covered the faith community. Is there something in a polarized, dysfunctional, angry environment on the Hill and in the country? Is there something distinctive that people of faith and religious communities can or should bring to this polarized discussion?
Well, I would say yes, and had tried to frame it up with this discussion of what does it mean to have social spending? Because in a bitterly partisan environment, it often comes down to fights about welfare funding, and sort of kind of taking away government benefits and critiques of bureaucracy that, to be fair, oftentimes fails. And that's a worthy debate to have. What I am anticipating, or perhaps looking out for the faith community to do more from an advocacy perspective, is try to redefine or launch a new debate over what it means to spend on social programs and what a social good is. We're seeing, even among conservatives, a greater attunement to the threat that climate change poses. I'm pretty sure they don't like the solutions outlined in this bill, but this debate could be a good opportunity for faith groups to broaden that lens a little bit more and have less of the typical last 30 years debate over social programs and social spending.
You're right. We can shape the debate. We can shift the lens a little bit. One person's social spending is another person's investment. This represents the most substantial proposed investment in families with kids, for example, ever. And that is not partisan. Mitt Romney has a proposal, but in this environment, it's all one party or the other that's going to prevail. Let me turn to the rest of the panel and ask you briefly, succinctly, right at the outset, what is the most important thing for 1,000+ people on this call to know about this debate from your perspective? Mary, you lead a progressive Catholic lobby. Ramesh, you lead a conservative publication. Carlos, you're forming an evangelical Latino Christian network. And Ashley, you look at this through the eyes of families in Richmond. What's the most important thing for people to know about this looming debate? Ashley, if I could, let me begin with you.
Great. Thank you, John. And thank you so much for the invitation to join you today. Thank you to the Georgetown Initiative on Catholic Thought and Public Life for the opportunity to participate in today's dialogue. There are two critical things to understand about this liminal moment that we are in right now. First, returning to normal cannot be the goal of the federal legislation. We do not need legislation that simply brings us back to where we all were in 2020 before the pandemic took hold. If that's the limit of our ambition, then we will have failed before we've even begun. Instead, we need legislation that charts a new path. We need bold and transformative policies to tear down barriers that for generations have shrunk opportunities for communities of color, for women, for low-wage workers, for kids growing up in poverty. That better, more equitable future is possible, and we have a rare opportunity right now to make it real, to aim for that other meaning of reconciliation that you mentioned. And that brings me to my second point. How we respond to this moment in many ways is even more consequential long-term than the fine details of this federal legislation. And that's because we are determining whether the federal government can respond to the challenges of our time. Of course, given the challenges of the last year and a half, you might expect people to be skeptical. In some recent focus groups, people were asked about provisions that were in the American Rescue Plan from March and whether or not they should be extended. And even when people were told that those provisions had the potential to cut child poverty in half, they were actually still unsure. And that's because they didn't believe such a thing was even possible. And so that's why this moment is so incredibly important. This is fundamentally about proving that our system of government, our American democracy, can deliver major, necessary, equitable policies that will help every one of us succeed.
Ramesh, let me turn to you. What do you think people ought to understand about this moment, this debate, these decisions?
Thank you, John. And thank you, Alana and Ashley, for that overview of what's going on here. I think just to make sure everybody's on the same page, because not everybody's as immersed as the people on this panel in it. When we say it's a reconciliation bill, it is a little bit of a term of art. It is a kind of bill that is structured to avoid a filibuster and thus can be passed by a simple majority vote of the House and the Senate. And because the Democratic control of both houses of Congress is so narrow, they have basically tried to cram in every part of their agenda that they can plausibly put into such a bill, plus a few things that they can't plausibly put in such a bill, and try to get it passed. And that means it is, above all else, a gargantuan bill. It is a bill that has some parts that I like, some parts that I dislike, but mostly it is just big. So, for example, the healthcare part of this legislation is larger in terms of spending and spending federal money over the next 10 years than the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare was. That was, of course, so controversial in 2009 and 2010. In total terms, we're talking about $3.5 to $3.9 trillion of ideas that are currently being circulated, although some people want to pare it back. But 3.5 to 3.9 trillion, that is larger than the Obama stimulus of 2009 that was so controversial. It's larger than anything that Bill Clinton did. And both of those presidents had much, much larger Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate. So in addition to being gargantuan, and including not just the healthcare parts that I talked about, but a lot of climate change elements, as Alana was talking about, some immigration policy, some abortion policy, this legislation, by nature of its size, I think is all, and the narrow partisan control of Congress, is precarious. So there are parts of it that in isolation, as John was saying, might be able to get bipartisan support. But when it's all packaged together in this huge Democratic wish list of legislation, it's not particularly targeted. It becomes much harder to get that. I think you're not going to get Republican support. And the question now is whether you can have a reconciliation, so to speak, among Democrats as to what they want to do and what they can agree on.
Thank you. Gargantuan, precarious. Mary, this all or nothing sort of approach. What is important for people listening in to know from your perspective as the leader of Network?
So because we're at Georgetown, which takes interfaith collaboration seriously, as do we, let me start by saying to my Jewish friends and colleagues during this Yom Kippur, I wish you an easy fast. So the language we are using for what is making its way through Congress is the Build Back Better plan, and it is good economic policy. The plan centers the needs of workers and families with investments that are especially urgent, given the devastation of COVID-19 and the economic recovery that has not fully reached the Black and Brown communities in our country. The plan is absolutely an investment in our country's future. Now, to pay for these investments, the plan proposes requiring the wealthy and corporations to pay their fair share of taxes and cracking down on tax dodgers. And this is where the faith community voices are so necessary right now. We are a small minority among the advocates on Capitol Hill, most of whom are well-funded K Street lobbyists who represent the individuals and corporations who have thrived during this pandemic. The country's billionaires saw their total wealth increase by 1.8 trillion over 17 months. These lobbyists are mounting a massive campaign against this necessary 21st century New Deal. Now, the images that stay with me, because I live across the street from the largest shelter in DC, is the tents. The shelter is not full, but people without homes are in tents everywhere you turn in DC, and the number of tents is growing every day. People are afraid of congregate living settings because they have lost their homes and their jobs, and so they're in tents. And then with the impacts of climate change, you have a multiplier effect. So the plan's proposed tax reforms would reduce the racial economic disparities we have seen exacerbated by the pandemic because they target income produced by wealth, including corporate wealth. It is scandalous that 55 of America's biggest corporations paid no federal income taxes last year. So by making the Build Back Better plan law, we invest in our people again, And that includes investing in creation, our common home.
Thanks, Mary. And thank you for acknowledging Yom Kippur. You speak for all of us in wishing our Jewish brothers and sisters well on this Day of Atonement. Carlos, you're an advocate, but you're also a pastor. What's the most important thing for people to know about these decisions?
Thank you, John, and I'm honored to be part of this program and be together with the other panelists. I will make two basic and quick points and then share with you a few questions that I think we must consider. Most people tend to see the work of Congress through the political or partisan lenses used by American media outlets. And for most Americans, what happened in Washington is alien to their daily life. There's no reason why the average American, that is the reason why the average American is not engaged in the day-to-day work of Congress this time. And never really, but this time we cannot afford not to be engaged. The legislation being considered in Congress, even as we speak, has the potential to radically improve the lives of millions of our brothers and sisters. And I will share with you something that we hear in the Circle of Protection all the time. Budgets are moral documents, reflections of who and what we as community value. So a moral document will be one based on the highest ethical behavior, and a moral budget will be built on a high moral standard. So I think we must consider the following fundamental questions. Will we continue to accept as normal a world in which we continue to have millions of poor people while a few continue to enrich? Who are we as a country? Who determines our values? Corporations or people? Our politics or our faith? Do we as followers of Jesus agree with Jesus's intentions that all live life to the fullness? Let me make just one brief last point. And I was inspired about this morning. God is involved in this process. God is with us. We must be keen to hear the word of God in the midst of all this process.
Thank you, Carlos. That was powerful. Having had the sort of the lay of the land shared by Ilana and an opening sort of big picture from each of you, let me turn back and start with you, Mary. First of all, congratulations on becoming the new executive director of Network. Network for decades has been a voice for the poor and for Catholic social teaching. Mary is a former Georgetown colleague. We've been friends for a long time. She's a great friend of the initiative. We worked together when she was working at the Law Center as an adjunct and as a campus minister on a session on the law and clergy sex abuse. But she's Network is blessed to have Mary's leadership. Let me ask you, take a step back a little bit. What are the biblical values? What are the principles of Catholic social teaching that people ought to have in their head when they think about this massive, gargantuan, and Ramesh's word, process? What are the core? We use the line, where your treasure is, there your heart is. That's probably a little too simplistic. What are some of the principles of Catholic social thought and the biblical mandates that ought to be considered in this process?
Thank you, John. And thank you for inviting me today. I'm also so grateful for your commitment over the decades to this work. So as to Catholic social teaching, we have to start with God, the source of our innate human dignity. And in the Catholic tradition, it is fundamental that each human person is a bearer of unlimited worth because each person comes from God, is made in the image and likeness of God, and will return to God. So this is what Jesus's parable in Matthew 25 is all about. I was hungry and you gave me something to eat, in prison and you visited me. The way we act toward others is how we act toward God. So human dignity, no matter who you are or what you have done, is the foundation. So next is solidarity in the common good. And this is more than just we're all in this together. Now, of course, we know that given the pandemic, which has revealed it really starkly. This solidarity in the common good is more about how we are made as members of communities. Our families, our neighborhoods, our institutions, cities, states, and countries. And Pope Francis has expanded this circle to encompass all of God's creation. So in our communities, solidarity means we make the concerns and needs of others our own. Because any dehumanization of one of us hurts all of us, whether we recognize it or not. The common good then means that to achieve solidarity, we seek the best possible outcome for all. We step outside of our individual needs to find solutions that benefit everyone. The common good requires us to recognize the injustices of a system that fails to meet the basic human needs of so many people. And finally, I would name the preferential option of those who have been marginalized by our systems and structures. And this means that because God desires a world where everyone is united, everyone's dignity is recognized. Those who bear the brunt of the social system and problems deserve particular care and attention. So the question operative for our public policy from a Catholic social teaching perspective, and this is not rhetorical, what is necessary to restore those who have been pushed to the margins, restore them to a place of dignity at the common table?
Thank you, Mary. You have so many credentials. You're a lawyer, you've been a litigator, you've been a pastoral minister, you work with the Leadership Conference on women religious, but you're a great articulator of our faith. And it's important to go back to those principles as we think about big issues like this. Let me turn to Ramesh. You, as I said, you're about to, in January, become the editor of National Review. It's been around forever. William Buckley, I think, was the founder. You work with, you write for Bloomberg, and I think your columns are syndicated. I've seen them in other places. You're a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. You contribute to national affairs. You've been a friend of our initiative. You've participated in a number of our dialogues, and I could get you in trouble for saying this, and maybe me in trouble too. I've found you to be one of the most principled, consistent defender of conservative values and other values we share. You took on Trump when he needed to be taken on, and you stand up for the unborn children in our public life in a way that challenges all of us to do the same. So let me congratulate you. One of the things I admire about you is you have stood up for the child tax credit, which in some ways is the centerpiece of this, particularly making it refundable so it goes to everybody else. But I bet you've already indicated you're not a fan of this approach. What are some of the problems with this approach and proposals? And given the unyielding Republican opposition, there's not going to be one vote. Was there a better way to do this?
Well, first of all, thank you for those kind and probably too generous words. I'm always delighted to take part in these panels because they're such a thoughtful group of people and questions that you bring together. It is true, as I said earlier, I mean, there are parts of this that I like. I have been an advocate of expanded tax credits for parents. And while, one can question some of the details, and maybe we would have had a better process if it weren't part of a partisan squabble. I think this is, in general, it's directionally correct. But I think that if you were trying to write legislation with the goal of helping the poorest among us and even raising taxes on the luckiest and most high earning among us, you would not have written the legislation that we are talking about today. And I think there are plenty of places where it falls short of that goal, to say nothing of the larger goal of human dignity. And I'll just go through three right now. First of all, as you've alluded to, John, there is the question of the Hyde Amendment. That is, for 40 years, we have had a basic policy of not having federal taxpayer funding of elective abortion. Sadly, the bulk of the Democratic Party's elected representatives now want to abandon that policy. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi wants budget legislation that doesn't include that protection for unborn children, a protection that has sometimes been estimated to save 60,000 unborn lives every year. So that is, I think, a pretty big line in the sand for a lot of us. But second, there's also this radical decrease in taxes that almost all goes to affluent people. And I'm speaking of the state and local tax deduction. There is, as a number of us have mentioned, there's a lot of moving parts, and it's not clear exactly what the final legislation is going to include. But if that provision, which some House Democrats say is a must-have for them, gets in, then you are raising a lot of taxes and then turning right back around and almost sort of precision targeting it towards some of the most affluent Democratic jurisdictions in the country. And then last, I would say, the Medicare expansion is not especially well targeted. So, for example, expanding dental benefits for Medicare, which, if fully implemented, will cost $60 billion a year. That is very, very high on Senator Sanders' agenda because he sees it as a step toward the Medicare for All cause that he's so enamored of. But we spend $14 billion a year in dental care under Medicaid, which is a much more targeted group, right? I mean, that's for the benefit of low income people, whereas Medicare is for the benefit of people who are more affluent than the national average. We're also talking about expanding Medicare to people age 60 and older. People 60 to 65 have the highest coverage rates of any working age group. So this is partly because of the sausage factory element of this legislation. I think that this is a gigantic bloated piece of legislation that does not actually target help toward those who most need it, and in some ways gives help to people who don't need it.
Well, thank you. Targeting protection for the unborn are two of the challenges you've raised. Let me go to Carlos. Carlos and I have been friends for a while. We've served on the board of Bread for the World. We were officers together at Bread. You are a co-chair of the Circle of Protection. You worked with more than 100 religious leaders in Christian churches together. If people think they have a hard job, imagine trying to get those folks to agree on what they ought to do together as disciples of Christ. And now you're leading an effort to build a Latino network of Christian leaders. You've been a pastor, you were state clerk of the Presbyterian Church. Tell us a little bit about the Circle of Protection, its goals, its priorities. It's been very clear about what it thinks are the most important parts of this legislation, and then add a word about what's at stake here for the Latino community.
Thank you, John. I'd like to say, although I don't know if this is correct, but I would like to say that the Circle of Protection is one of the best kept secret of the church in the US. I hope that it's not a secret, but kind of. Not a lot of people know about the Circle of Protection. The Circle of Protection is a unique coalition of about 50 Christian denominations and organizations, very, very diverse. Include organizations like the National Council of Churches and the National Association of Evangelicals. So if you want some diversity, you have diversity there. Diverse denominations like the Episcopal Church and the Salvation Army, which very, very different ends of the theological perspective. All those churches and organizations have come together to seek and to find common ground on basic justice issues, particularly around the issue of poverty. We may have a very different theological perspective on social issues. Still, the Circle of Protection has found common ground on the gospel call to promote a society without poverty. Let me say that again. We have found common ground in promoting and work towards a society that it doesn't have poverty. One in which God given dignity of every person is upheld and is protected. And we believe that poverty is not a Christian value. Let me say that again. Poverty is not a Christian value. On the contrary, there should be no poverty in a society that supposedly is guided by moral and faith values. The Circle in particular endorses the extension of the recent improvement in the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. The federal child tax credit, it's a partially refundable credit that allows low and moderate income families to reduce their tax liability dollar up to $2,000 for each qualifying child, making the full value of the child tax credit available to the poorest households has substantially already reduced child poverty. And we can share the numbers, so we don't have the time here. The Circle of Protection is of one mind that this particular provision should be made permanent. And I think we're moving there, but we hope that the goal is to make it really permanent. The improvement to the earned income tax credit, which is a benefit that benefit low-income working adult, it helps low and moderate income workers, families to get a tax breaks. That credit can eliminate any federal tax that people owe at the tax time. If the EITC amount is more than what someone owes in taxes, you get money back in your tax refund. So we do support that as a Circle of Protection. And one last point it hasn't been mentioned here that is important for the Circle of Protection. In view of America's affordable housing crisis, the Circle also support a generous expansion of housing vouchers because people need where to live. There's so many people, as it was mentioned, I don't know if it was Ramesh or someone, I think Mary mentioned about homelessness in our country. That's a huge crisis in our country, and the Circle is supporting the expansion of housing vouchers. I believe you asked me, John, also about the Latino community, and I'll try to be brief on this. The Latino community will benefit from the proposed legislation as much as any other community. Let me just throw a couple of numbers about the Latino community. In the 2021 census, we found out that Latinos constitute now more than 50% of the total US population growth. Secondly, the total Latino population grew from roughly 50 million in 2010 to 62 million in 2021. This legislation will close the racial wealth gap by expanding affordable housing and investing in Latino, also in Black and Native American entrepreneurs and communities. And the legislation will establish free higher education, expand childcare, universal pre-kindergarten, a national pay leave program, healthcare, tax benefits. These are provisions that will dramatically improve the life of our Latino community. I don't know if I have time, John, if I may, one less particular issue affecting our community is immigration reform. And immigration advocates point to polls showing strong public support for opening the citizenship doorway. And studies show that immigration spurs economic growth. An early budget draft of the one that is being considered proposed creating a multi-layer pathway to legal permanent residency and potential citizenship for 4 particular groups of immigrants. those who are brought illegally to the US as children, called dreamers, others who fled violence or disaster in certain countries, and essential workers and farm workers. Let me just finish by saying the legislation also includes funding for securing a border improvement in this process of immigration. Interestingly enough, Senator Sanders, who is probably one of the most liberal members of the Senate, mentioned border security. He said, we got to pay attention to border security. So border security is something that it's also should be and is included in this legislation. I'll finish by saying that we don't know what will finally happen with this immigration issue. The Parliamentarian of Congress will say what will happen with that, but that is an important part of what is being considered in this legislation package.
Thank you, Carlos. I should point out that when we founded the Circle of Protection, I was working at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, their members, Catholic Charities USA, and the St. Vincent de Paul Society. So we have a lot of Catholics on this call, and I want to make sure they know. The other thing is, on the refundability point you mentioned, which is, complicated. Here's what I know. If it isn't, the refundability pieces are not made permanent, my grandkids who are okay, they're not doing great, but they're doing okay, will get the child tax credit. But 50% of Black families and a third of Latino families, the poorest families in the country, wouldn't. And that's just not right. Ashley, we try in our initiative to get beyond the Beltway. Sometimes we fail. So much of this is about politics. So much as this is about number 3.5 trillion, a billion here, a billion there. What I learned about you and why I think you can add so much to this, you don't live in that world. Your initiative, the Commonwealth Institute for Fiscal Analysis in Richmond, sort of looks at this from the bottom up, from your state, how this touches regular people on an everyday basis. You come from a history of advocacy with the Director of Advocacy and Policy for the National Multiple Sclerosis Society. You're a Fannie Lou Hamer Fellow. You're going to be inducted to the Hall of Fame for the Pennsylvania School of Social Policy. I didn't know schools had Hall of Fames for advocates, thank God. You grew up in California, but now you look at these issues in Virginia, in the state capitol, from the bottom up. How does this touch ordinary people? Help us understand what this debate and decisions means for poor kids and low-income families and communities of color in Virginia and across the country.
Thanks, John. So at TCI, we are believers in people-powered change. And to us, that means that policy work should be rooted in the lived experiences of directly impacted communities. It also means approaching this work with generous humility. After all, who's a better advocate for let's say, raising the minimum wage than someone who knows the crushing stress of living on $7.25 an hour? Or who understands the need for criminal justice reform better than someone who is formerly incarcerated and who is struggling to get back on their feet? The people who have faced these kinds of hardships in their lives are the real experts, and they have the unparalleled insights about how to solve policy problems, but only if we're willing to listen to them. And this kind of approach to policy change is necessary, but it's also not enough by itself. At TCI, we also shine a light on how race shapes policy decisions, past, present, and future. We do this in all of our research and our analysis. We do this when nobody asks for it. We do this when it makes people uncomfortable. But ultimately, we do it because it's not possible to understand how we got to where we are today, or to fully grasp the promise or pitfalls of policy ideas without looking at race. I think Mary mentioned, at the beginning of this crisis, there was talk about how this virus doesn't discriminate, and there was perhaps some optimism that the crisis would bring people together. But we have seen over the past year and a half how that really didn't come to fruition in many respects. And a lot of it, quite frankly, came down to race. Which neighborhoods people have access to, the healthcare people have, transportation, and high-speed internet, which people are more likely to work in essential jobs where face-to-face interaction is required, which business owners had the connections to get the PPP loans. And in terms of the economy, some of the top line numbers are stronger than were initially anticipated. And some families have recovered or even come out ahead economically. But when you look deeper, there are still worrying levels of economic hardship in Virginia, especially among Black and Latinx families and other people of color. And that's not to say that public policy or economic opportunity has to be a zero-sum game with winners and losers. In fact, in her book, The Sum of Us, Heather McGhee notes that it is possible to build an economy where everyone can thrive. And we all know that racism and prejudice has too often stood in the way of our collective progress, but that's not preordained and it's not inevitable. And we collectively have the power to change it.
Thanks for that analysis. Race is at the core of so much of our choices. Can you say a word about how things like the child tax credit, the ITC, the investments in housing and nutrition make a difference for families in Virginia, both the investments that were made during the pandemic, but also the potential investments in this legislation?
Yes, absolutely. We hear a lot about the big price tag of this federal legislation, but behind the price tag, behind the budget scores are actual people. There's families and communities. And I would hazard a guess that they are thinking far more about different numbers in their daily lives. For example, Virginia is still down about 190,000 jobs since before the pandemic. Last month, over 330,000 adults in Virginia reported that their household did not have enough to eat. And about 1 in 8 renters in Virginia reported being behind on rent. At the same time, the benefits of certain policy choices made earlier this year have been really undeniable. In Virginia alone, the newly improved federal child tax credit helps nearly 1.6 million children in the month of August. And for many, the checks helped families afford school supplies or clothes for the new school year. In addition, rent and utility relief helps families maintain a roof over their head and keep the lights on. Investments in public transit have allowed people the greater opportunity to get around. But some of these were one-time policies or they have expiration dates. And the next federal package represents an opportunity for us to build on these successes for the long term. But it's also important to understand that the federal package that's moving through Congress right now will be paid for. What has been consistent is that revenue will come from increasing tax rates for wealthy individuals, for profitable corporations, and through stronger enforcement of the country's tax laws in order to prevent tax evasion. But the vast majority of people, however, won't see any changes to their taxes. And on balance, this approach will create a more equitable tax code, but also funding a variety of those programs that create an economic opportunity for all.
I see folks want to get in, but I want to turn to questions. We have a lot of questions. 3 of the big categories are the national debt, immigration, and housing. And let me start with debt. Here's one I identify with. I'm 79 and we have 21 grandchildren. I'm 71, we have 7.5 grandchildren. We are concerned about both the national debt and fundamental changes in our country. We're concerned about the impact of our grandchildren. And then another question, what responsibility do we have as Catholics to be caretakers of the overall health of the economy, whether in recession and depression disproportionately affects the poor? Should we avoid debt as a part of this duty? Alana, what is the political part of this debt? The big number, 3.5 trillion, is used to say this is too much. And then others, what's the moral responsibility in addressing questions of debt?
It's important to note that the debt limit is going to be likely tackled separately from this bill. And I say likely because the current plan on Capitol Hill is to attach an increase in the debt limit to a government funding bill, which will keep federal agencies and things flowing past September 30th, which is fully separate from this. That said, Republicans are planning to oppose that approach in the Senate. So we may very well see the debt limit become part of this debate, which makes this very relevant. And the debt limit needs to be raised right now because of spending already incurred. So Republicans are claiming we will not support any increase in the debt limit because the Biden administration is proposing all of this social spending, when in truth, a lot of stuff incurred during the Trump years is what's prompting the current need to increase the debt limit. And that's really important to note because this is being turned into a partisan issue when in the past, members of both parties have supported this because it's a matter of keeping the nation's credit stalwart. Now, that said, fiscal hawks in both parties have also opposed it. So this is not really along the lines, right? But, going back to the social and moral dimensions of the debt, it's completely reasonable to ask oneself, is this bill going to be so large that inflation is going to result from this down the line? It's going to make ordinary household goods more expensive for Americans. And is that bad? And there's a moral dimension to that. Families need to be able to afford milk and bread. So it cuts both ways here in terms of the morality of this issue. But I wanted to be clear about the specifics substantively first.
Sure. Mary, what's your take?
I'll just add to what Alana just laid out perfectly, and that is that this package does not impact the debt. This package is going to be paid for. And so throwing the debt question in the middle of this is a red herring that we need to not respond to.
Could I?
Ramesh, I bet you have a perspective on this.
I do, yes. Look, I think that the number of voters who share that concern about the debt as a top issue, that's gone down. And that's why you don't actually see people in either party who are consistently taking debt issues very seriously. And I think, frankly, that some of the arguments people who are concerned about debt and excessive federal debt have made over the years have turned out to be wrong or exaggerated or premature. It didn't lead for many decades to a big spurt of inflation. It didn't lead to a huge hike in interest rates. And so there is a little bit of a boy who cried wolf aspect to those of us who are concerned about the debt. But that said, I think we should still be concerned about the debt. I do think it is imprudent to count on happy circumstances lasting forever. And I think that while Mary is, I think, right, depending on, again, how all of these things shake out, you might not have a net increase in the debt from this bill. I think it's not irrelevant either, because when you raise all of these taxes on high earners and corporations, and then you use it to, for example, fund benefits for people who live in Chevy Chase who want a bigger tax break, then you don't have that same tax increase available later on if you do want to tackle the debt, or if you want to make Medicaid more generous for dental benefits, or if you want to do any number of other things. So many times we hear people talking about various nice sounding or even actually good ideas, and they say we're going to pay for it with this tax hike on rich people and corporations. And look, I want to keep tax increases in general down as much as I can, but most importantly, you can't keep counting those tax increases to fund each and every initiative. And there, I think is where this problem that I keep coming back to of the size of this, because it's been said to govern is to choose. And to a large degree, the Democrats have decided that they don't want to do that in this piece of legislation.
That's really helpful, all three perspectives. Reverend Carlos mentioned immigration. How is this immigration likely to be a part of this, and why is the Senate parliamentarian so important in that discussion? I mean, a lot of us have been working for the Dreamers and for a pathway to citizenship for a long time. The country supports it. There is hope this legislation could actually bring it about, but it's really complicated whether this can be a part of this legislation. Who wants to weigh in on that?
John, very quickly on the previous question, I'll go to this second question. I was part of actually a Circle of Protection small group conversation with a ranking member of the House. And he left us with our mouth open because he made the comment. Someone asked him, Congressman, how this is going to be paid for. And immediately he said, I don't care who's going to pay for this. He said, we have not invested in the American people, and the American people deserve to receive the benefits of their hard work because they are the one who are sustaining the American economy. They are the one who are living their lives every day, putting their lives in the line for our country and sustaining our country and our economy. We must invest on them. Nobody answers back to him. So in regards to the to immigration, we all know that immigrants contribute highly, not just to our economy in our country, but to the cultural enrichment of the life of our country, the moral, social, spiritual. Talking about immigrants, particularly Latinos, take the Catholic Church. I mean, the Latinos are at the heart of the Catholic Church in our country. So they're contributing to the fabric of everything in our country. And we know that by bringing them out of the shadows of a system that have forgotten them for so long, the contribution will simply maximize. So we need to do that. We've been postponing on doing that for so long. And the Latino community is completely frustrated, to be honest, with both parties, with the Republican and with the Democratic Party, because they have not stepped up to their responsibility to work and for the Latino community and immigrants in general. Obviously, we don't know, as you mentioned, John, if this is something that will happen in this legislation, because basically what the Democrats are doing is seeing this immigration issue as an economic one, and that's how it is being proposed in the legislation. We'll have to see if the parliamentarian of Congress will see with the Democrat that this is an economic issue, and they're bringing immigrants out of the shadows and providing a path to citizenship. It's part of the economic system and how we will improve the economic system.
Ashley, I want to come to you on the housing question in just a second, but Elena, can you explain to us the process on how the decision will be made, whether immigration can be a part of this legislation?
Yes, I'd be happy to. The Senate parliamentarian is going to take a look, and it's important to note she's a former immigration lawyer, so she has a lot of experience with these issues. She's going to take a look at the relative budget impact. So Democrats made their presentation and essentially said this is relevant for the budget reconciliation process, which Ramesh also ran through very effectively in terms of what it lets them do. It's a budget thing, right? So Democrats went up before the parliamentarian and said this affects the federal budget because we're going to give all these folks a path to legal status and they're going to accept federal benefits. We're talking tens of billions of dollars a year. It's a big federal budget impact. Now, as Mary said, they're also arguing it's debatable at this point whether it will be fully paid for, because again, we don't know what this final bill looks like yet. They want to fully pay for it. That's a big bill. So we're in this weird situation, and my team did a great story on this, where Democrats are arguing, please let us exert a lot of pressure on the federal treasury by giving new immigrants a lot of federal benefits. And this is something that conservatives have typically hammered at them for. So it's just such a unique moment we're in right now, and it speaks to how aware Democrats are that this is their last chance to really get immigration reform done. But that said, it's up to the parliamentarian to determine is what they're saying is the budgetary impact substantial enough that the rules allow for it to be on this bill.
Ashley, before I ask you about housing, obviously there are so many immigrants that are part of the fabric of life in Virginia. I wonder if you have a comment on how this package and its efforts to provide a path for citizenship might affect human dignity and human lives in Virginia. And then a journalist friend of ours, Dennis Sadowski from Catholic News Service, makes the point that stable housing is the basis for a stable life. However, the lack of affordable housing presents a huge burden for low-income families. What can be done in this package and other packages? What should be done to make decent housing at affordable rates available to families? So, impact of immigration, and what about housing as a priority in this package?
Sure, thank you. The TCI has not weighed in or really followed the immigration issue in the federal package that's currently moving forward in Congress, but I would agree with Reverend Carlos on many of your points. I mean, it's incredibly important to make sure that everyone has access to the support and the resources that they need, whether they're undocumented or not, whether they're immigrants or not. And in Virginia, we know that about 140,000 essential workers are undocumented and do need the access and the resources and the supports that the package is going to be providing. In terms of housing, the bill currently in the House that's moving does make historic investments in reducing homelessness and housing instability, including about $75 billion for the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which serves families with the lowest incomes, including families with children and people with disabilities and with seniors. And this is so incredibly important because, as we've seen, the pandemic and the economic insecurity that has resulted because of the pandemic has really put a strain on housing and has really put so many people in the position where they could lose their housing or have already lost it. And so putting more money into the housing voucher program in particular would be an incredibly important step.
Thank you.
Could I say one additional thing about the housing problems we have? Thank you. I think that that the housing situation has gotten, particularly in parts of the country, quite bad. And a lot of that is a regulatory problem. It's a kind of using regulation to keep low-income people out of the area, really. And that is a very, very difficult problem for the federal government to surmount. I mean, there have been proposals, mostly from our progressive friends, about doing this, but the federal government's never really pulled the trigger on localities that make it hard to build housing. And I do think that a fundamental change in that area is going to be necessary for us to overcome that problem.
Thank you. Ramesh mentioned the huge challenge of the fight over the Hyde Amendment. It's probably not my place, but it seems, not very smart in the middle of a fight like this to try and repeal decades-long policies, which have said that abortion's available, but no one has to pay for it with their tax dollars. The House committee has said they'll repeal that, whether the leadership does that. But I want to flip this a little bit and say, for those of us who are pro-life and work in the pro-life movement, economic pressures are enormous on young women facing these choices. And greater investments in children and families could, in fact, bring down the abortion rate. Anyone have a thought on either part of that?
I just want to address the Hyde Amendment portion, and that is there was a pretty consequential vote in the Senate during their last budget debate, where 50-49, with Joe Manchin siding with Republicans, Hyde-type language was symbolically rejected. So despite Pelosi's intentions, it's very unlikely we're going to see Hyde part of this debate, and that's simply because it doesn't have the votes in the Senate. So I just wanted to make that clear to folks.
Any thought about the other side of the equation, providing assistance to women who face pregnancies by themselves? Mary?
Sure. And first of all, I couldn't agree more with what Alana just said. Reading the political tea leaves, we agree. The approach that you have laid out, John, is exactly what Network has done for 50 years, is support pregnant women through the kinds of investments that we are supporting, that the Circle of Protection is supporting, that Ashley has laid out, being so important. Fulfilling the promise of the Affordable Care Act by ensuring that all states are permanently expanding Medicaid because we actually think that healthcare is a right and not a privilege. Stopping families, working families, from having to make the impossible decisions between caring for their family and economic security. So it includes implementing a permanent and universal national family and medical leave program. This is something that so many other global North countries do, and we just have failed to do that. The housing, which we've already heard about from Ashley, closing the digital divide, which also makes raising a family, especially in pandemic times, really critical. Carlos has talked about the immigration pieces, but there's also ensuring that everyone has access to Medicaid, no matter what their status is and whether they were incarcerated or previously incarcerated. That's also critical.
I have a wonderful closing to this dialogue, which I'm going to skip in order to ask each of you, if we have more than 1,000 people listening to this, what advice do you have for them as to how they could make their voice heard, how they could impact the debate and decisions on the moral and the human dimensions? Carlos, I think you might have to duck out. Let me go to you first.
Thank you, John, again, and to all the panelists for allowing me to be part of this helpful and important conversation today. I believe I'll go back to 2 points. One, it's engagement. People need to be engaged, and we cannot let Congress to work without the influence and the advice and the voices of people throughout our country. So people need to be engaged. Secondly, I'll say that when we look at this, we don't need to look at ourselves. Often we judge things for where we are at and what is our experience. Yes, that's important. But in this kind of issues, we need to look to our neighbors. How are they going to be affected? I may be a well-being middle-class person who are living a nice, perfect life. But that's not the reality for most Americans. And so my faith is informing me that I must think about my neighbor and not necessarily about me when we make these decisions. Thank you, John.
Ilana, you're a reporter and editor. You don't give advice, but you can analyze. How could people have an impact on this discussion?
Well, to circle back to what I said to open this dialogue, which has been really wonderful, and thank you for sharing all your thoughts. Let's name this something that's not reconciliation, because that's the way that it will pass. And I think people of faith need to start thinking about, what do we want out of this? And frankly, this is something Democratic pollsters tell us that they're working on. People like the idea of it, but they just don't know how to think about it. So I think the best way to do that is think about it, call your representative, get involved, decide what you want to see in it, because reconciliation is not what it is.
Mary, how about you?
Thank you, John. Underscore what Ilana just said. For us, from a Catholic perspective, the sin is indifference. We have to be a church willing to leave the building and be in relationship with our community. And billionaires and corporate lobbyists benefit from the status quo. So ask yourself, what does it mean to be a good Catholic and a faithful Catholic today? So go to networklobby.org/actnow. Email your members of Congress about this Build Back Better legislation. How's that? And we also think it's important to keep this going with the Freedom to Vote Act for reasons that we can talk about maybe in another program. Learn how to write a letter to the editor, talk to your friends and families. This is an exciting moment in US politics for the common good.
Ramesh, instead of beyond just reading National Review and your columns, what should people do?
Well, I think that learning about this legislation in various places, including Politico, should be a first step. And it's hard to get a grasp of all of it. And maybe you just want to look at one piece of it that's of particular interest to you. But I do think that if you contact your congressman, they do listen. They do take that kind of engagement seriously. And I'll just plug one little thing. I do think that the Hyde Amendment part of this is one of those areas where people should engage. I hope that Mary and Alana are right about it. I'm a little less confident for various reasons. One of them being that there may be only so many things that Joe Manchin can single-handedly block his fellow Democrats from doing if they want to do it. And because there are ways of sort of having the Hyde Amendment while undermining it. You know, you create a new program that isn't subject to those limitations. So I think it's very important that that those of us are pro-life, and maybe particularly those of us who are pro-life and support other aspects of this agenda, to say to congressmen that this would be a serious and grievous error.
Ashley, you're the reality caucus in our discussion. You're making your case every day in Richmond and beyond. What advice do you have to others as you advocate?
Yes, John, as I've had the opportunity to share with you, this work is deeply personal for me. I trace my own lineage to people who were enslaved in Virginia, and today I'm raising 2 Black boys in Richmond, the former capital of the Confederacy. I'm leading an organization that fights for racial and economic justice. So for me, every day is a small act of rebellion, but also hope. And to see how this pandemic has unfolded has also been to see the legacy of slavery in America and countless policies that have caused and calcified lasting disparities on the basis of race. And in a pandemic, those disparities were really more like accomplices. In these challenging times, leadership from state governments has been essential, and Virginia has really made some substantial policy changes to advance equity, but the states cannot do it alone. And it's time for us as advocates to tell Congress to seize the opportunity, dismantle injustices of the past that we still feel today, and help this country emerge stronger and more equitable in the pandemic's wake. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that about your own history, your boys, and the continuing legacy of slavery and racism. I want to thank each of our panelists, Mary, Ramesh, Alana, Ashley, and Carlos, who has had to leave. This has been a terrific discussion. It will be posted on our webpage pretty quickly for those who haven't been able to see it. I want to especially thank Jim Wallace and Jim Simpson, our new colleagues at Georgetown in the Center on Faith and Justice. Of course, my colleagues Kim Daniels and Anna Misva, who make this possible. And I want to say our next gathering at the initiative is an extraordinary one. Pope Francis asked the Archdiocese of Washington to gather young people to talk about his encyclical Fratelli Tutti. And so we're working with the Archdiocese on a series of dialogues for young leaders. And the first one is going to be Who is My Neighbor? Washington, Afghanistan, and Haiti are the examples. On Thursday, October 7th at 7 p.m., we'll have Cardinal Gregory, but we'll also have young leaders talking about their own experience as an Afghan refugee in Haiti, in working for justice in Washington, and interfaith and other voices. So I want to thank our panel. I want to thank all those who joined us, and I urge you to get involved and see what happens. It may not be reconciliation in the way we understand it, but it's really important. Thank you very much.